Now, before we dig into the situation in Taiwan, let's review what happened in the past. I sort of prepared this presentation last month, and so I added an extra year of data to my presentation. The average GDP growth in Taiwan is less than 4%. And you could see this is the overall GDP. Services industry account for some 68.5% of Taiwan's GDP, and industry accounts for some 30% of Taiwan's GDP, and a large part of these industries belong to manufacturing industry. Now, what is the contribution of these industries are making to the GDP in Taiwan? Now, even though industries account for some 30% of Taiwan's GDP, it contributes more than 50% to GDP in Taiwan, and services industry accounts for almost 70% of Taiwan's GDP, and yet they only contribute to slightly more than 40% of GDP, and therefore industries are very, very important. What is the current situation of Taiwan's economy now? If you've paid any attention to what's happening in Taiwan, you will realize that people in Taiwan, the general public in Taiwan, the media in Taiwan, and the lawmakers in Taiwan are very concerned about the GDP growth in Taiwan. So what constitutes a nation's of GDP? Now this is data from last year. $3.51 is our GDP, and domestic demand is 2.83. Net export is 0.69. And from domestic demand, you can break it down into private final consumption, 1.48, government final consumption, 0.46, gross capital formation is 0.89. For net export, we'll look at export of goods and services, which is 3.91, and you minus these of import of goods and services, which is 3.22. Now, if you look at the brown shades, they are related heavily with external demand. Or you could interpret it as what or how much we are generating from other countries. They have very little to do with domestic demand. However, for the past 5 to 10 years, there is a lack of momentum in investment. FDI has been decreasing and domestic investment has been decreasing. And yet, Taiwan has always been relying on export. And therefore, many people call Taiwan as a nation which is export-oriented. And Taiwan's economy has been relying on export. Now, if we can boost up export of goods and services, then this is going to boost up our GDP. However, we can't really control external demands. Now, if you could look at this very busy graph, let's look at the red curve first. What is this? This is the growth rate of Taiwan's export. And this red curve indicates that the growth of export has been decreasing. I apologize for this small font. Now, this is what happened at the financial tsunami. So this is a special case. This is an outlier. And last year we had 5.63. So the range is about 3.5 to 5-ish. And the value of export that accounts for GDP accounts for some 70%. And therefore, we are an export-oriented nation. Some 70% of our GDP is generated from export. However, the contribution rate of export has been decreasing. So this is alarming. So this is alarming. We are losing our competitiveness in terms of export. Let's look at the import and export situation in Taiwan. The volume of import and export is some 500 billion US dollars. We have data from 2013 and 2014. So we export some 300 billion US dollars and we import some 260 billion US, and so we have some 40 billion US of surplus. So these are the contributing factors. So what do we export? Now this, as I showed you before, services industry accounts for some 70% of our GDP, and industries account for slightly less than 30% of our GDP. And what do we export? Well, we export most of our manufacturing products, and our goods and our services industry we only export some 16.8% of our services. So even though services industries are booming in Taiwan, and yet they're limited within Taiwan, which is very different from what's happening in Hong Kong and Singapore. So what exactly do we export then? So these are the top 8 products that we export. The largest one is electronics. Second is base metals and articles of base metal. I'm going to talk about it later. And the third one is plastic, rubber, and articles thereof, chemical, machinery, minerals, optical instrument, IT and telecom. Now, IT and telecoms are very important industry in Taiwan, and yet we only export some 14.7 billion US dollars of IT and telecom products. What are our major trading partners? The major ones, some 40%. goes to Hong Kong and mainland China, and ASEAN plus the 6 nations in ASEAN. The third one is the United States. Some 20 or 30 years ago, our largest trading partner was the United States, and now United States is our third largest trading partner. And this is what's happening. And what do we import? Is less than 300 billion US dollars. We import agricultural and industrial raw materials. We also import capital equipment. Consumer goods, not very major. So what is the implication of this data then? The previous slide tells us that we import a lot of equipment, raw material. And what do we do with them? Well, we process other people's materials by using other people's equipment. So we are just doing OEM. In the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned the fact that we're losing momentum in investment. As you could see on this graph, from year 2007 to 2014. Now the blue curve is export. The domestic is the green one, domestic investment. The green one is pretty much at the bottom of the graph and is moving down. Okay, let's look at outward investment. Approved outward investment by the MOEA in Taiwan. Now, we need to break this data down into 2 categories. Outward investment that goes to mainland China is about 10 billion US dollar a year, and outward investment that goes to countries other than mainland China accounts for some 5 billion US dollars. And in 2014, the number went up. The next one is more important, is direct foreign investment. I was talking about Taiwanese capital going out of Taiwan, and now this is foreign capital coming in to Taiwan, and of course they have to be approved by the Ministry of Economic Affairs. It's about 5 billion US dollars, plus and minus, and capital investment coming into Taiwan is about 300 million US dollars. And 4 years ago, we had less than 100 million US dollars coming from China. We had less than 100 million US dollars from mainland China. Why? Because the Taiwanese government restricts mainland capital investing in Taiwan. The items that they could invest, the amount of money that they could bring in, and also the conditions are all set up by Taiwanese government, very restricted, and therefore is very discouraging to Taiwanese investment coming from China. Now, if, as I said, we are heavily dependent on export, and yet export has been decreasing. If we were relying on investment to support our economy, then investment is also decreasing. Now we're not exporting and nobody's investing, and of course this is going to hamper employment situation in Taiwan, and income has also been decreasing. People in Taiwan have complained that they are not making more money. Well, because investors are not investing in Taiwan. And of course, if we put all these factors together, Taiwan's economy is going to suffer. And this is alarming. So what are the problems then? Why is there a lack of investment momentum in Taiwan? Well, what is there to invest? If Taiwan wants to attract foreign investment, then there needs to be investment targets. So what are the investment targets? What are the projects that people can invest in Taiwan? I may be going off the tangent, but when we invest, what do we consider? If we are running a manufacturing business, well, of course, I would choose a location geographically closer to the source of materials. The second, I could choose a location closer to the market. Once I finish producing the products, then I could sell the products immediately. Well, a location without resources, without a substantial market, what is so attractive of it? Our domestic demand is very small, relatively small. And of course, if we are located in a very huge market, then we'll be very attractive. However, can we provide such an incentive? And also, do we have very sound regulations and very open and transparent foreign investment? They would want and expect our laws and regulations to be similar to those in the United States and European Union. And therefore, these are some of the factors hampering foreign investment. Why are we losing our competitiveness in export? Well, I mentioned earlier in my presentation that we export mainly manufactured products. What are the major two items for our services then? Number one is aviation. Number two is tourism. I was with China Airlines before. Now, these are the two major export services. And also, the industrial structure is focusing too much on what I've just mentioned. So our core products are also losing competitiveness. We were able to produce what others could not produce. Then, of course, we had our competitiveness, and now other countries are catching up. And also, the market. Many countries are engaging in regional integration. And yet, we're not part of this regional integration. What do we need to do then? We need to open a market. We also need to deregulate and open and to promote industrial transformation. We also need to be members of TPP and RCEP. We also need to sign FTA with different countries and regional blocs. Now, in order to do all this, then we need to prepare ourselves. How do we prepare ourselves? We need to transform our industry. We need to open up our market. We also need to deregulate. And then we'll be able to sign FTA and be part of TPP so that we can promote trade and investment liberalization in order to improve our international competitiveness so that we can have a sustainable economic development in Taiwan. I'd like to talk about our CEP and TPP. Our CEP stands for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, headed by China. So these are the different nations. TPP is headed by the United States. Now these two blocks are major ones. Now it is important for Taiwan to be part of either one. If Taiwan is not part of either one, then what will happen to Taiwan? Now, because of political realities and diplomatic realities, Taiwan could only participate in WTO, AIPAC. There are 21 economic entities in AIPAC. Russia, Papua New Guinea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong are not members of any regional blocs of TPP or RCEP. I'd like to draw your attention to RCEP. They account for some 56.56% of our trade volume. For members of TPP, they account for 35% of our trade volume. So these are the countries that are major trade partners of Taiwan. And once TPP and RCEP are finalized, and yet Taiwan is not part of this, then Taiwan is going to be marginalized. Why? Because there's going to be trade and non-trade barriers erected between Taiwan and our trading partners. Members of TPP or members of RCEP will not have any trade barriers among them when they trade. Now, of course, can we generate a very fat margin in order to overcome tariff? Well, if we can have a very fat margin, but it's very difficult. What about non-trade barriers? Non-trade barriers or non-tariff barriers are more difficult to overcome. We won't be able to export to these countries if there are non-trade or non-tariff barriers. So these are going to be very important for Taiwan.